live and on location. Well, we're recording it live. We're not actually going to be producing it live. This episode will actually drop tomorrow. But we are at the NBA's 2023 annual conference in Philadelphia, PA, home of our birth of our nation.
Yeah, absolutely. And these last couple of days and a couple more, 3,500 folks from across the industry here to gather and discuss issues of the day during these challenging times.
Yeah, it's been a great morning. I got to start my morning listening to Tim McGraw sing two of his greatest hits. Were you able to catch that, or did you have another meeting to go to?
I wasn't able to stay there for the time that he was singing, but I saw him up on stage with John Meacham.
Yeah, Meacham too. What's your favorite John Meacham book? I can only imagine that you've read one or two.
Thomas Jefferson.
Okay, yeah. Which is
actually my favorite, because I served in the George H.W. Bush administration, was his biography of Bush 41.
He talked about that today. He worked on that for 20 years.
Yeah.
John Meacham, if you don't know who John Meacham is, he's a Pulitzer Prize winning biographer. But what I loved about his interview today is how down to earth, how sarcastically humorous he is. And he's doing this interview with Tim McGraw, and they're buddies, but they're like ribbing on each other.
Oh, yeah. No, that he had hoped that he could write the book about Songs of America with Faith Hill as opposed to Tim McGraw, but, their relationships worked out nonetheless.
Oh, yeah, you talk about, Meacham was talking about, yeah, because he and Tim McGraw are obviously doing something for the NBA, but they're also promoting their book.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think they've been doing a tour like this for a couple of years since the book dropped.
So I want to kind of jump into this because I know we have limited time. And I mean, you are someone who is in the know. You spend your whole entire career is in DC working on Capitol Hill, correct? Lobbying.
Yeah, I've worked in and around public policy, whether it's with executive branch agencies or on Capitol Hill for the bulk of the time I've been in Washington.
So you're a guy that probably knows a thing or two about not just what's going on, but a little bit of, you can look into the future and give us a lay of the land of what to possibly expect. You can make some hypothetical guesses better than most.
I've done a fair amount of soothsaying, in terms of sort of predicting which way the winds may go, which is part of the job because you have to sort of anticipate on behalf of the industry, who the key players are going to be and what some of the roadblocks might be to see if you can't sidestep them. So I do a little bit of that from time to time.
Yeah, just so the audience knows, you won't remember this because I'm sure you gave a speech like this 100 times a year ago, but it was a year ago or 2 years ago. You sat down in a room of probably 20, 30 mortgage bankers. We were up in 1919 M Street doing something. And you came in to speak like you normally do and give your 15 or 20 minutes, but you laid out the 2022 election, like all the way down to the Republicans more than likely aren't going to take both the House and the Senate. And it's going to be much closer in the House. And, if they do get the Senate, it's going to be 50-50, 51-49. And you crushed it. Like literally on election night, all the talking heads were shocked, but not Bill Killmer, because it laid out like you thought it would.
Well, that's generous of you. I'm sure that discussion was stream of consciousness at that particular time. But yeah, that's certainly part of it is, we're participants and sort of constituents by proxy through the NBA on behalf of the industry. So we have to build relationships with these folks and have to anticipate, where our friends or foes might be given any election cycle. So that is certainly a part of the drill.
So before I get too geeked out with you, which is what I plan on doing, like John Coleman, who produces the show with me, he likes to say, sometimes with D.O., you just wind him up and let him go. I told you before we started recording, hey, Bill, my goal is to wind you up and let you go. You're going to make my job easy. And you laughed. You're like, man, I wish my staff would see it that way. I guess maybe there's times where
my staff thinks that it takes me 5 or 10 minutes to introduce myself to a crowd. So they just wish that I would be a little more brief. So if you wind me up, prepare for, me doing a filibuster, but I'll do my best.
Perfect. Well, so briefly, how would you describe to the audience your role within the MBA? Like understanding 65% of our audience is they are mortgage professionals. What are you as Bill Killmer with the MBA? What are you doing day to day for us?
Yeah. Well, really, MBA is a great think tank on behalf of the industry. And I say that in the best possible way because you do better when you're making policy arguments if you have facts to back up where you're coming from. So working with our public affairs team, with our economics and research team, with our subject matter experts for both residential and commercial multifamily members of MBA, and then my team, the legislative and political team that does the Grassroots, does fundraising on behalf of our political action committee for the industry, but then also have direct lobbyists that are up with each quadrant of Congress, House and Senate Republican, House and Senate Democrat, and then I supervise that group of lobbyists and the fundraising and grassroots staff within that whole MBA ecosystem so that we can take the policy positions the members have decided upon and try to either play good defense or good offense. So I've had the pleasure, the honor of being the chief lobbyist for MBA for the last 13 years. And, I wake up every day feeling pretty good, and the team does too, about the fact that we're connecting to policies and trying to get policymakers, lawmakers, regulatory officials, directly or indirectly, to do what's best on behalf of those that are trying to get better shelter for their family and be a part of the American dream.
Yeah, so like most recently, Ron has been on your to-do list. Trigger Leads has been on your to-do list, right? You and your team, you're actually getting into the Senate chambers or into the House chambers or the office meetings, maybe not the chambers themselves. And you're having those conversations with the elected officials to let them know to support this particular bill or not to support this particular bill. And here's why.
And to drill down, that's precisely right, Dustin. That's our job, really. My team directly, functionally, to lobby legislators and their key staff who are sometimes as critical or even more critical to as they instruct the senators or the members of the U.S. House that these are the positions that industry has taken and that we would most definitely align with or hear the arguments that they're making. So you mentioned just a couple of those issues. I mean, affordability and housing supply certainly part of that mix because we just don't have enough homes right now, in our country across a whole panoply of markets, not just isolated in a few spots, but really a lack of inventory across the board. That's a big issue, obviously. Making legislators aware of the headwinds the industry is facing so that they don't create more frictions or that they can lean into the regulators to try to prevent that. Certainly keeping government open. So those Ginnie securitized HUD, USDA, VA home loan programs, the insured programs are available. If we were to have a shutdown, what does that mean? What are the implications for the average consumer? Flood insurance.
Yeah.
You don't want to have flood insurance lapse, and it's been tied to these continuing resolutions or funding bills over the last decade or so because we just don't need the additional friction of that, forcing people to perhaps step away from the closing table if they were at a point where they were going to do so, particularly at a time when there is enough of that going forward. And I can go down a long list of other issues, tax policy items where we're trying to help push for housing tax credits that would help us increase housing supply with government support. You mentioned Ron, you mentioned trigger leads. Insurance and the availability of insurance is a big issue. And then other regulatory matters like the CFPB. There's a case before the Supreme Court that questions the constitutionality of the funding stream for the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And if the court were to rule, no predictions as to where that might go, but they've just heard oral arguments that the CFPB or a portion of the structure was unconstitutional. What does that mean for the rulemakings? And we don't want the mortgage regulatory apparatus to sort of descend into chaos. And so continuity and pushing for that and being ready to work with the Congress if they had to step in pending that court ruling is another example. And then the Basel III, banking accords, that the in-game proposal that would have a particularly negative impact if it's not altered on the mortgage space and mortgage servicing rights and risk weights and the requirements attached to that, which will ultimately get passed along to the consumer. So those are just, a few examples of the things that we're working on.
This is what I love. Wind you up and let you go. Like, I'm going to take a pause because our hardcore audience, like, they hear me talk about going to NAC every single spring, the National Advocacy Conference. Typically it's in April. This year coming up, it's in March. It is my favorite conference to go to because everything Bill's talking about, if you want to participate for a day and be like Bill for a day, you get that opportunity to march on Capitol Hill, to meet with your state representatives and to advocate all these types of topics that are near and dear to our hearts and really what's best for our communities. you can do that. Or those hardcore TLOPers, we call them, by the way, Bill. So if you're like, tune in twice a week, every single week, you go to our website, TLOP Online, you're a member, you're a TLOPer. They go on TLOP Online. I have links to MA. I have links to MORPAC, and they hear me talk about it because MA is the Mortgage Action Alliance. That's the grassroots effort, right? That's where, for no money, you can make sure your voice is heard with a click of a couple buttons. So like, if you're in the mortgage industry and you're not a member of MA, like, yo, go over to tloponline.com. There's a link right there. Go ahead and sign up. And then once you're a part of MORPAC, that's when you can kind of put your money where your mouth is in terms of making some donations. But typically in order to do that, we want you to be a member of MA first. But I make sure that I do it because when I listen to you speak and you rattle off all of these issues that are current, I also know that once we get through these, there's going to be a new wave of issues and a new wave of issues, which keeps you employed for 35 years in Washington, D.C.
Well, it does. And you hate that that's sometimes the cause and effect. But at a time when the industry's contracting by necessity because volumes are down and because interest rates, obviously, that environment has changed rapidly. And there's not adequate supply, that does not mean that the number of policy issues contracts as well. In fact, I think we're facing more challenges, and there are steeper challenges because the industry is in that portion of the down cycle. So the stakes are even higher, and I think the level of engagement, and you mentioning MA, you mentioning MORPAC, the opportunities for people to engage as industry members, but also invest in their own future so that we can be more effective on Capitol Hill on the industry's behalf is a huge portion of the whole ecosystem of how we try to advocate on behalf of the industry. And I am happy to talk about the National Advocacy Conference because I made a reference to how we as staff for NBA are constituents by proxy, but there's nothing more dramatic than having constituents actually take the time, come to Washington, or meet back home in the district or in the home state for a senator, but come to Washington, take the time, walk the offices, and press the issues from a practitioner's point of view. Explaining what the impacts are, not only to your business operations, but more importantly, how it's impacting the policies that they're debating are impacting your customers.
Well, and having been to DC multiple times for that conference, like I can tell y'all, your elected officials, they do want to hear from you. Or their staff, they do care to hear. They don't know what we do for a living. Just like you probably don't know exactly how a bill becomes a law, although it's taught to you twice, once in middle school, once in high school. You probably forgot it. They don't know the mortgage industry. They want to hear you tell stories about your one borrower who you were trying to do a pre-qual with, but because you did a pre-qual, now they're getting 18 unsolicited phone calls, emails, and text messages because someone sold their trigger lead. They want to hear that, and we want them to hear that so that when we go to them later down the road and say, hey, HR 2626 is currently in the House. You should vote yes on it. And here's why. They can put a story with 2 letters and 4 digits and kind of have it make sense and all come together.
Yeah, and I'm glad you raised the trigger leads example. The bill that we prefer actually is HR 4198.
Oh yeah, by the way, I made up 2626.
No,
I
know you did. That was a hypothetical. But I mentioned that because we've worked alongside the office of the Congressman from Tennessee, John Rose, who dropped that bill. It's our preferred approach to solving abusive trigger leads and how you would curb their use. There are some legitimate reasons, I think we all learned through the pandemic or relearned during the pandemic, that a servicer needs to be in contact with their customer. And those who originated the mortgage, that's a different relationship, even if they sold the servicing, with the customer, other than somebody who's just trying to use the opportunity in a very intense and competitive market to try to mortgage, to market their services. So trying to build the right kind of funnel to limit the abusive trigger leads is one of the important things we're working on. And we're close to getting a bipartisan bill potentially introduced in the Senate. And these are difficult times to get legislation enacted in Washington, even the big stuff that has to be done, like funding the government or the geopolitical considerations with everything going on around the world that, the United States needs to be in a position to help fund our allies. et cetera. So a smaller bill that deals with the Fair Credit Reporting Act and one aspect of the mortgage industry, it's a challenge, but there still are pathways. And, really it has to be a combined effort of folks pushing from back home and being engaged, and then what we do on a daily basis on the industry's behalf in DC.
Yeah, so I'm going to dive into kind of the current climate and the current environment. Remind me, though, I do want to circle back because you mentioned affordable housing. And I have a generic question that if we have time, I want to ask you as it pertains to affordable housing, because I always get stuck personally trying to figure out, well, is this a national issue? Is it a state issue? Is it a local municipality issue? And my answer has always been, I believe it's all of the above. But someone like you would actually be able to offer some substance and some texture probably behind my very common answer. But I don't want to miss out on this opportunity. So yeah, we have a war going on in Europe. We have a 3,000-year-old war that's been resurrected in the Middle East. We have a House with no leader. We have a presidential election in, oh my gosh, like 13 months. We have a Federal Reserve who can't find the brakes, and maybe that's their foot stuck on the gas. What are you seeing through your lens the next 13, 18 months as it pertains to, both chambers getting along, actually passing legislation, the presidential election? How's that going to impact housing? What is the Biden administration doing about housing, if anything? Curious your take on all of that. I'm teeing you up and I'm going to sit back.
Well, I'll try not to give you a generic answer on that question or one on affordability. Look, these really are kind of unprecedented times, and I don't mean that as a default answer to just blow smoke at your audience. There is now a speaker pro tempore of the U.S. House. That's a position that was created in the wake of 9/11 so that there would be continuity if, God forbid, kind of like some of the TV series scenarios, you had the designated survivor. And lo and behold, for different reasons, you had this unprecedented action of the House rules allowing for this motion to vacate, and we now have a former Speaker, Kevin McCarthy. But in the modern era, the U.S. House has always been governed by the conference or the caucus, Democrat or Republican, and who they elected within their own ranks to be the leader, and then an assurance that they'd have enough votes from that majority that even if it was a totally partisan breakdown, and you didn't get any votes from the other side of the aisle as a speaker candidate, that you would get the office and you'd have the certainty of being able to make the leadership decisions for the basic operations of the House, scheduling legislation, working with committees, kind of running the railroad and keeping it on time, making sure that funds are appropriated to keep the federal government open, defense appropriations at a time when you mention the stuff that's going on around the world again. And all of that has ground to a halt. So, on November 17th, we'll have the specter of another government shutdown, which will have implications for housing consumers at, multifamily or single family, and our members at MBA and how they're impacted in their work with those customers or end users of the financing that they're providing. So that has implications, and the clock is ticking.
Because to the layperson, Speaker of the House is essentially the CEO of the House of Representatives.
Yeah, in concert with the other leadership, the traditional roles, and some of the names are different depending on the party, but there's a speaker, there's a majority leader who sets the daily agenda, and then there's a whip who's supposed to marshal the vote count. Well, that's become an increasingly difficult thing to do if you have these different niches and fractures in both the Republican and the Democratic, caucus gatherings of different people that are either to the far left or the far right, and a diminishing number of moderates who have some sort of commonality in the middle between both parties. So I'll sit here and tell you that on this date, on a Monday in Philadelphia with you, I'm not sure who's going to be the next leader of the Republicans to be speaker. I think that ultimately the system's durable, and we'll get through this. And I'm a cautious optimist, like John Meacham mentioned earlier today, Dustin, in that regard. But yeah, we have the specter of what is probably likely to be a pretty fractured presidential election in 2024. You may have the same two folks who ran against each other, the incumbent president and former President Trump. At least that's what the polls would indicate now, despite the weakness, despite the uncertainty around the world. despite the economic conditions. And you mentioned the overlay of regulatory agencies, the executive branch. The Biden administration does have an affordable housing policy. Now, whether that is leaning more into subsidized housing, you can make an argument about that, but then you have the Federal Housing Finance Agency regulating Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And then obviously you have HUD and the critical role that they play. And we're in front of these folks at the White House, the National Economic Council, all the regulatory bodies that matter to the industry on a regular basis. But the Fed is a different body by definition, governing the monetary policy despite its economic policy mandate. And, we as an industry are, definitely in a recession and a slowdown, but the rest of the economy is not there. It's really kind of an unprecedented time. And you can't just use the old bromide that housing is going to lead you into and out of recession, because we've different circumstances with the with the pandemic, obviously. So, when the Fed is going to actually become more dovish in reverse rates and the impact that will have on Treasury spreads and the long bond and how mortgage rates might react to that. Obviously, we'd like for the Fed to take more certainty, but lobbying them is very different than lobbying the Congress. Often we're lobbying the Congress to try to weigh in with the Fed because of the influence that they might have. So I think it's going to be a rocky ride for the next 13 months, next 18 months. As I said, I'm an optimist, and I think that our system is durable. But, podcasts like this, the way that information flows instantaneously, it's really changed our politics, and we're seeing that rapid change before our eyes. And it's our job to work on the industry's behalf within all that change.
Is lobbying the Federal Reserve, does that fall under your umbrella, or is that more your colleague Pete's?
That's a shared piece by really a full bunch of our colleagues. Our chief economist, Mike Frantantoni, spends an awful lot of time exchanging data and opinion and forecast with the Federal Reserve, because there are many economists that work there, but the Fed is also an important regulatory body, and so we do have subject matter experts that interact with the Fed, and on the occasion that their regulations, we mentioned Basel III, they're very much the lead agency in that regard on that rulemaking, that their regulatory scope and agenda does impact mortgage. So it's a different central bank kind of approach you have to take. It's not the same as lobbying your legislature and going up to Capitol Hill to meet in the office.
All right, so I'm gonna do some rapid fire. I think we have like 10 minutes left to go. Hakeem Jeffries, is there a path to him to become Speaker?
I don't think there's a path to Hakeem Jeffries becoming Speaker unless Democrats retake the majority in 2024. And there's a slim margin. It's 4 votes now that Republicans have as their majority with the vacancies right now. Things could change. And I think we're in an era here, relatively the last several election cycles, where you've seen that, the ping pong back and forth of neither party having a very large majority in either the House or the Senate. So it's possible. I'm not a believer that there's going to be a moderate, the Republican, Democrat, bipartisan coalition that might lead to a Speaker. Jeffries.
That's a total uprising of the party in power, right? But isn't it only 6? Right? Would you only need 6 current Republicans in the House to flip?
Sure, it's a small number of people that would have to flip, but you really wouldn't want to do that for the breadth of support you need for that dramatic a change. You'd really have to have a much larger number.
Okay. So. I want to dig into, because we have time, because you mentioned affordable housing, and this is a pure, I'm curious, is affordable housing something that we look to the federal government for, or can they not solve the real issue at hand, whether it's the inability to find cheap land, the inability to develop land, to change building code ordinances, or or is it everything in concert? How could the federal government make it easier for towns, municipalities, counties, et cetera, to make home ownership more affordable?
Well, it's really kind of a carrot and stick approach that the feds can take. You're right. The underlying premise of your question is that land use and building codes and all the other intersections that lead to how you construct housing, whether that's single or multifamily, is regulated and governed at the state and local level. And there's not much that the federal government can do other than encourage those jurisdictions to be more mindful of the need for affordable housing. So you see zoning questions being examined, and you see sort of test case templates from around the country. But something that worked in Minnesota is not necessarily going to be the right solution in Florida, or even in one jurisdiction within Florida as versus Texas as versus California. I mean, it's $125,000 and probably even more than that before you ever put a stick in the ground.
Yep.
Once you get land entitled in most jurisdictions in California, just because of environmental impact and all the other, work that has to be done, prior to construction. So, or the, land development process to begin. So really encouraging HUD to perhaps condition some of its funding, CDBG funds for communities, or the home program funds or things of that sort, as carrots, rather than having sticks to say, there's a mandate for this particular kind of approach to affordability. And look, affordability and affordable housing is one of those terms that's kind of in the eye of the beholder. A lot of people hear that and they think just subsidized, government mandated housing. And that's not really market. There are market rate affordable housing solutions, and it really will take public-private partnerships to solve this approach. But there's a regionality to it as well, because some states and some jurisdictions have more available land, and more available land that's in a position to be built upon. So creating more supply, beyond the complexity of rehab and rehabilitation of existing housing stock, it's a complex web. But the feds really can be an encourager more so than a mandator on affordable housing.
Yeah, it's interesting. Being a practitioner, being boots in the ground, in the trenches with the troops, so to speak. And I live in Central Florida. I honestly tell people that based on my experiences, I don't see us not having an inventory issue for the next decade, because I don't see a path to, at least in that state. Maybe in Indiana it's different, maybe in Nebraska it's different, but in Central Florida, I don't see how we're going to be able to incentivize a home builder to go build more units at a price point that allows a first-time home buyer to purchase it, afford it, and the builder to turn a profit, because home builders are for-profit entities. And when I start thinking about what could the federal government do? Okay, maybe if we got better immigration policies, maybe could we find slightly cheaper labor, maybe, but that still doesn't help us acquire the land.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's certainly an important part of the equation as well. But you mentioned the price point and being able to build at a level that truly is affordable for the consumer, absent some kind of government subsidy. And I had mentioned earlier in one of your questions the potential for housing tax credits that really could help, because that will be the, filling the gap so that you can incentivize a contractor to potentially do single family. And there's been a very successful program since 1986 that some of these, newly proposed tax credits on the single family side are modeled after the low income housing tax credit, which is the single biggest generator of new multifamily affordable housing in the current tax code. So there are examples of how you can, take public policy steps to make affordability more within the average citizen's reach. I will say one of the things that MBA has done, and they're almost like little laboratories in different cities, Memphis, Columbus, Philadelphia is another city.
Convergence,
where it's the Convergence program, which is really an attempt to create these laboratories to bring the nonprofit community, the government community at the state, local, and federal levels in those various jurisdictions. And then importantly, you can't do this without private industry to try to show what works, because what works in Philadelphia is not the same answer in Memphis, and certainly not in a jurisdiction like Columbus. So the whole part of that is to try to do the doable, win the winnable, but set a template out there so that other jurisdictions might follow those examples.
So I appreciate your carrot and stick analogy, right? Going to the home builders as the federal government saying, if you do X, I'll reward you with Y. If you build a home for $300,000 or below,
right,
then you will qualify for a $5,000 tax credit on that one unit. Versus like the stick, which be, if you don't do this, then I'm going to penalize you.
No funds are available. And a lot of that is also the carrot and stick with the various local and state jurisdictions to build more readily towards transit, or to build with, affordable housing needs and, an actual number of units that you want to try to produce within a given period of time as part of, the way that they're regulating affordability, but also, how communities are developed within those various jurisdictions.
All right, I'm going to flip the script. We have like 2 or 3 minutes left. Bill's crystal ball. Does Biden earn the Democratic nomination, assuming, no issues with health?
Yeah, no issues with health. That was my trapdoor, to answer your question.
I mean, is
yes.
there even a case out there that he would step down and say, I'm not going to do this?
Yeah, and look, this is kind of simple arithmetic. Those that ran against him when he won the nomination and became the incumbent president in 2020 after that election have all declined to run again. Vice President Harris isn't going to run against him. You see Governor Newsom in California, sort of putting feelers out, and others around the country, but they're really kind of stage setting for the post-Biden environment. So absent health, I think he's the Democratic nominee.
And ex-President Trump?
Yeah, I mean, look, the polling would indicate that he's well ahead in the Republican primaries, and you've had a good number of people that have been vying in the primary, spending a lot of time in Iowa and New Hampshire and South Carolina, and they're not really making a considerable dent. So I won't even go down the rabbit trail of, a candidate for president or a former president who's been indicted and then potentially convicted and might be running for office in jail. Those are all potentialities, and really, I think that's why we have an institutional risk that I mentioned earlier. I mean, the rule of law really is an important factor here in abiding by whatever the various jurisdictions might decide with respect to former President Trump and candidate Trump, if that's the reality. I think things are shaping up for Biden-Trump one more time.
Liz Cheney as a third party?
I mean, somebody like that. I think there will be independents, and they could be a factor. I mean, Robert F. Kennedy is declining now to run as a Democrat, and probably will have more of an impact in the election space as an independent. Ralph Nader always traditionally ran as the Green Party candidate. He said he's not going to do that, and it's certainly his candidacy, just like the Perot candidacy, helped decide the Bush 41 Clinton election. Because he, took votes from both, but really probably took more from H.W. Bush in that election cycle. You saw Nader make a difference in the Bush-Gore, election that was, hair raiser close, and the Supreme Court had to decide at the end. But that really subtracted from some of the votes that Gore would have had. So independence can matter. I think we'll see an independent, whether it's Kennedy or someone else, who may make a difference.
If you're not willing to answer this, I totally get it. But if you were to pick a dark horse candidate that wasn't named Trump or Biden, who would you put your money on? Like, you're making one of those crazy prop bets.
Republicans, I don't know how much stock I'll put in the answer I give you. That'll be my qualifier. Republicans wanting an alternative to Trump are pointing a lot to Governor Youngkin of Virginia. And a lot of that is, yes, he found a way to thread a needle in a purple state. Who could self-fund a lot of his candidacy, but also could raise a good bit of money. But it is a long shot, in my view, to see him become a viable candidate or take a nomination away from Trump, particularly coming in at the last minute.
And on the other side of the aisle?
I don't really see anybody emerging on the Democratic side, but a bunch of people will jump in if, God forbid, something were to happen to the president and he had to decline to run.
One of those probably be Governor Newsom, right? I mean, that would be probably
that would certainly be a name to be out there. I think you should see some of the candidates who ran in the 2020 cycle probably reconsider as well.
Awesome. So I'm going to wrap this up. One of the underlying themes of the show is everything you should have learned in school but didn't because it wasn't taught. So what is one thing you're looking back of your 40-year career, the success you've had, what is something you wish you had learned or was taught to you earlier in life?
That's a great question. I kind of think back to my civics class in our classes. There's a bit of a twist is I'm grateful for what I learned in school. Now, I will tell you the reality of having been in and around Washington since 1985 and having a series of jobs with increasing levels of responsibility you know, a growth of some cynicism in terms of how things actually are accomplished. Not that I think it's a smoke-filled room and you know, dirty actor kind of environment. There are those elements to, you know, every aspect of life, including, you know, folks in financial services, you know, or you know, pick an industry.
Little League baseball.
Yeah,
you can go down to Little League
absolutely,
baseball. Yes.
Absolutely. That's why I love politics, because politics essentially is how people get along and how they coalesce to pick those amongst themselves to lead them and make tough decisions for them, because, you know, we believe essentially in a Republican form of government with a small r, you know, to govern ourselves as a republic and delegate that authority to people, but we're democratically electing them. And I see a lot of stresses in that system, and I wasn't taught that in school, but I don't see how anybody back when I was at Richfield High School in Waco, Texas would have anticipated what we're kind of living through now in this information age.
Awesome. Bill Killmer, Chief Lobbyist, Mortgage Bankers Association. Thank you so much for your time today. You and I have a conference to get back to. I'm sure you have a couple more speaking engagements to get to. He's Bill Killmer. I'm Dustin Owen. You've just tuned in to the Loan Officer Podcast. That's all the time we have for you today, but we look forward to catching you on the next episode.
Thank you, Dustin.